Secretary Adams, thank you so much for sitting down with me today.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about election reform. Obviously, during the pandemic, you worked closely with Governor Beshear to make sure that Kentucky had a system that worked, especially as people were home, because this was at the height of the pandemic when we had our primary and general elections. So now in 2021, there's been a bill passed. So talk a little bit about what the new bill does in comparison to what we had.
Well, even before the election was over in November, I began preparing a bill and assessing folks' opinions, especially the county clerks, about what we ought to keep from what we had changed. Everything that we had changed was on a temporary basis through emergency powers. Everything that we changed was designed for a pandemic, but we discovered some of these things actually really worked on their own regardless of a pandemic, like early voting. So I spent several months talking to the county clerks, talking to local officials, talking to legislators, and that resulted in a bipartisan task force that ultimately produced House Bill 574. So we kept early voting. We thought that weeks and weeks of it was too much. We got a big subsidy from Congress last year to pay for our election. That subsidy's been spent. We thought a few extra days really helped people vote, but wasn't overboard and didn't make the campaigns too long. So that was a good compromise. That's, I think, the most important component of this bill, but there's lots more in there too.
Absolutely. And other states have not fared so well in these discussions, as we know, throughout the pandemic and then afterwards as well. So what have you seen in other states in comparison to the successes that we've seen in Kentucky?
Well, as far as I can tell, we're the only state that has had a bipartisan coalition pass a major election reform law this year. You've had election laws pass in other states, but you haven't had what we did here. What we did here was unique in that it was bipartisan. It was seen as fair and legitimate. Number one, that gave us, I think, a better policy because everyone's perspectives were included. Number two, it just gave us a better look. You don't want to have an election law passed by just one party, then the other party won't trust you and won't trust the system, and that hurts turnout.
Right.
You actually saw that in Georgia. You had Republican turnout drop in their runoff election because the Republicans thought that the election was rigged. So I think it's really important to do this in a bipartisan way. It's a better product and a better policy. But the mistake other places are making, and it's not just states, actually, it's Congress too. Congress is trying to pass a one-party election bill, in this case the Democrats, that actually would strike down our law here in Kentucky, strike down our photo ID to vote, strike down our cleanup of our voter rolls. You can't have one party making the rules. You've got to have both sides working together.
Have you talked to Senator McConnell and Senator Paul and the delegation about that bill and trying to make sure that we keep what we've passed here in Kentucky?
I haven't needed to. They've been very out there complaining about this legislation, so there's no daylight between us on this issue. We all oppose it.
Now, when we talked back in 2020, you and I, about this system, you talked a lot about the fact that this system would help you clean up the voter rolls. People who no longer live here, people who are deceased, people were sending ballots to potentially to help cut down on fraud. How has that gone? How have you been able to clean up the voter rolls, and what's the progress been?
We've made great progress. To put this in perspective, we haven't had a Secretary of State since Trey Grayson, 3 Secretaries of State ago, who took seriously his job of cleaning up the voter rolls. When I ran, I pointed out, this was an issue for me in my campaign, that we had hundreds of thousands of people that we knew, it was undisputed, we knew had moved away, passed away, or been put away, and yet they were on our voter rolls. My predecessor was found by a federal judge here in Frankfurt of having violated the law by failing to do her job. She was derelict in her duty. So it was important to me to keep that promise to the voters and to follow the law. We've had several months we've actually taken more dead voters off the rolls than added live voters. That's pretty hard to do, especially in a presidential election, given the interest you have of voting. But we've been very vigorous about that. What we found is, though, that most of the people on our rolls that we thought we should take off were still alive, and they've moved to other states, and they're voting in other states. Just about every week I'll get a letter from the Secretary of State of Idaho or South Carolina or Florida, you name it, and they'll say, "Dear Secretary Adams, here's a list of people who've moved to our state and are still on your rolls. You should take them off." And I said, "Yeah, but I can't." So one of the things in this new bill is actually a closure of a loophole that I requested be done. Now I don't have to wait for 4 years to take someone off the rolls who's voting in some other state and still on our rolls. I can go ahead and take them off immediately. That's, I think, going to put us on track to take 400,000 voters off our rolls by the end of my term. That's my goal. That's a pretty audacious goal, but I think we'll get there.
It absolutely is. So let's talk more about the election itself. And, precincts was a big deal during the pandemic. So we cut down the number of precincts, especially because we couldn't find the poll workers to help. So moving forward, especially because we have an election coming up next year, what will that look like?
Well, it will depend on what the counties want to do. We've delegated to them whether they want to keep all the precincts open under the 1891 model that we inherited when I took office, or if they choose, they can consolidate precincts. You're not going to have what you saw in 2020. You're not going to have two places to vote or one place to vote in a place like Lexington or Louisville in a primary. It won't be that radical. But we are allowing some consolidation of precincts at the county level. Let me give you a specific example. I was in Crittenden County yesterday speaking to the Chamber of Commerce, and local county officials were there. And they told me that our bill is going to save their county $60,000. And here's why. Under the old law, you could actually consolidate your precincts, but if you had, let's say, 4 neighboring precincts, they could share the same middle school gym or whatever voting location, but they had to have 4 sets of machines and 4 sets of poll workers. And a poll worker from one precinct couldn't check in someone from another precinct. That's absurd. That led to long lines and inefficient use of taxpayer dollars. It's also hard to find poll workers. It was hard before I took office to find poll workers before the pandemic. It's even harder now.
Right.
So this bill, again, this is optional for counties, but if they choose, the counties can consolidate. They can allow, instead of 4 sets of machines at this central location, 1 set of machines and 1 set of poll workers. But they actually move the lines much faster. Anecdotally, when I voted in 2016 for president, under the old rules, it took me 3.5 hours in line to vote. And in 2020, it took me 30 minutes. It's just a much more efficient system, but it also saves money on election machines and it saves money on poll workers. So it's a win for everybody. But we're going to let the counties decide if they want to do it or not. It's totally their decision.
Well, we love to hear about the local chamber involvement and talking to local chambers.
You bet.
And you brought up the fact that the federal government was paying for some of our postage and things for the mail-in ballots. So we're saving money on some fronts, but how does that look going forward? Because people will still be able to do mail-in ballots, correct?
Well, interestingly, people say you had no excuse absentee voting. Why don't you continue that? And my response is, no, we didn't.
Right.
We had COVID excuse absentee voting. That's different.
Right.
We've had in our laws for many decades absentee voting. It's actually a right in our state constitution. It says if you're out of the county during in-person voting, okay, you can vote absentee, that's fine. If because of your age or health, you can't come out and vote in person, that's fine, you can vote absentee. That was the law before COVID, that's the law today. We didn't change that in any respect. We've actually made some improvements to our absentee process. One is we're keeping the portal. I think it's the most important thing we did last year actually is the absentee portal because it allows voters to apply for their ballot electronically, allows us to verify their identity. We've never done voter ID before for absentee ballots, now we do. And we allow the voter to track her ballot. So there's total transparency. The voter can track it, the clerk can track it, I can track it. And that's how we were able to avoid lost or stolen ballots last year. So that's important, so is the cure process. With the cure process, I'll give you a statistic. In 2018, 7.5% of the absentee ballots in our state were just thrown in the garbage. And the voters were never told about it. It's scandalous. And this was simply because signatures of those voters on their absentee ballot envelopes had changed since they registered to vote. Well, I'm 45 years old. I registered in 1994. My signature looks different today.
Right.
I've got 3 grandparents still alive. They registered to vote for Dwight Eisenhower, and theirs looks a lot different.
Right.
It used to be their ballots would just be discarded with no notice or consent. Now, we actually contact them and give them a chance to prove their identity, notwithstanding a mismatched signature. That's good for access. It's good for enfranchising voters. It's also good for security, because if they say, no, that wasn't me, well, now we've got a line to go investigate a potential impersonation for vote fraud. So what we've shown, I think, is you can improve both access and security at the same time. We did that with the portal. We did that with the cure process, even with early voting. Early voting makes it harder to cheat. It's harder to run a vote buying operation over a period of several days than on just one day of chaos at the polls.
Very true. So obviously the bill was a big success for you in 2021 in the session, but you had some other involvement in the 2021 session. At the end, you were the one signing some of these bills into law, especially with some of the vetoes. But what were some of the other big successes in the 2021 session from your point of view?
Well, I was really pleased to see police reform. That's obviously not an issue that my office regulates, but I was glad just as a Kentuckian to see that. I thought it was important. I was glad to see a budget passed that I thought is going to make some major improvements, including broadband expansion. That's really important, I think, in any period, but especially right now. I did get to sign some bills myself. I didn't know this when I ran for office, but in Kentucky, under our unique system, if the governor's veto is overridden, the bill comes to the Secretary of State. It drops down a notch, and I get to sign bills. And so my predecessor never really did a whole lot of that, but I've taken advantage of that to do some bill signings.
Now, is there anything else going on in your office or anything else that you want people to know about?
Well, we do a lot here. I'm the Chief Custodian of Records for the Commonwealth. I'm the Chief Business Officer of the Commonwealth. Obviously, the election stuff takes up most of our time and kind of plays to my strong suit because I was an election lawyer before I ran for office. So folks ask me what's next for me, and the answer is implementation. And that's a little dry and boring, but that's really what this job is about. I'm an executive official. My job is to run an office and be an administrator. And so now we've had two of the biggest bills pass in 2 consecutive legislative sessions were my bills. Now we've got to implement them. We implemented photo ID to vote last year, and now we've got to implement House Bill 574. And that it's not as simple as it sounds. There's a lot of meat there. I've got to do training of county clerks and election officials around the state. That'll be easier to do as we reopen in the future. But there's a lot to do, that plus the voter rolls. So I've got plenty to keep me busy the next 2.5 years.
Absolutely. Well, Secretary Adams, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.